Welcome to Michekyakeymi. Okay, so yeah, let me start like this because I don't want this to sound like one of those videos. I'm not here to shock you. I'm not here to throw names at a wall and see what sticks. And I'm definitely not here pretending I have some secret information nobody else has. I don't. I'm just honestly trying to say out loud why this whole thing still doesn't sit right with me, even now, even years later. Because when people say the Epstein files, they usually say it like it's, I don't know, like it's a single thing. Like there's one folder somewhere, one list, one final document that, if it ever came out, would suddenly make everything make sense. And I get why people want that. I really do. We like clean endings. We like villains and conclusions and justice that looks organized. But that's not what this is. The Epstein files aren't one thing. They never were. They're pieces, fragments, court records, depositions, emails, calendars, contact books, flight logs, sealed exhibits, settlements, testimony that never got challenged, stuff spread out over decades in courtrooms and institutions that, honestly, don't love being questioned. And maybe that's why the story won't go away, because it didn't end. It just stopped, and that's a weird place for something this serious to stop. Officially, Epstein was a financier. That's the word everyone uses, financier. But if you slow down for a second and actually think about that, it's still strange. Like, okay, financier of what exactly? For whom? Through what company? Because every time journalists tried to map it out, it kind of fell apart. There was no public empire that matched the lifestyle, no clear structure that explained the access. And yet, he moved like someone important, not like someone trying to get in, like someone who already belonged. Presidents talked to him, billionaires spent time with him, universities took his money, scientists met with him, celebrities socialized with him. He wasn't treated like a nobody, he was treated like someone who mattered. And that's the part that lingers. Not just the crimes, those are horrific and clear, but the way so many systems seemed willing to accommodate him long before anyone was forced to ask hard questions. Or maybe before anyone wanted to ask them. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is turning this into a story about one evil man, one monster, one outlier, because that version is easier to digest. It lets everything else off the hook. It suggests the system works most of the time, and this was just a rare failure. But this wasn't a glitch. This was a pattern. Epstein didn't operate alone. He just didn't. He had staff, assistants, drivers, pilots, property managers, people whose entire job was to keep things smooth, quiet, functional. And at the center of that world was Ghislaine Maxwell, who was later convicted for helping recruit and traffic underage girls. That conviction matters. I don't want to minimize that. It was real. It wasn't symbolic, but it was also limited, very limited, because the trial stayed narrow. It focused on her actions, her role, her crimes. It didn't open the door to the broader ecosystem. And that's where the discomfort really starts, because proximity to Epstein didn't automatically mean guilt, but it also didn't automatically mean innocence. And the legal system never fully explored that gray area. Not publicly, not under oath, not with the kind of pressure that forces clarity. When documents started getting unsealed years later, people reacted fast, emotionally. Headlines exploded, names surfaced, timelines got flattened into tweets and thumbnails, and nuance just completely disappeared. Some people assumed every name meant a crime. Others assumed every defense meant a cover-up. But the reality is messier than that. Court documents are messy. Depositions are messy. People get named for different reasons. Some because someone mentioned them in passing. Some because they were in a contact book. Some because they attended events. Some because a victim accused them directly. Those things are not the same, but once everything hits social media, it all blurs together, and that blur doesn't help victims, it doesn't help truth, it creates noise, and noise protects everyone. The flight logs are a perfect example. They became this symbol, this shorthand for guilt. But a flight log doesn't tell you why someone was on a plane. It doesn't tell you what happened. It doesn't tell you intent. It tells you movement. That's it. That doesn't mean they're meaningless. It means they're incomplete. And incomplete information, when treated like final proof, actually shuts down real investigation instead of encouraging it. And then there's the moment everything changed. August 2019, Epstein in federal custody, dead. Official ruling, suicide. And look, people argue about that endlessly. But even if you accept the ruling, you still have to sit with how badly the system failed around it. Cameras that didn't work, guards who fell asleep, required checks that didn't happen. Failures so extreme that even the Department of Justice acknowledged them. That alone should make anyone uncomfortable. Because once Epstein was gone, so was the chance for a full trial. No testimony, no cross-examination, no moment where he had to sit under oath and explain himself. Dead men don't talk. And trials aren't just about punishment. They're about exposure. They're about forcing timelines into the open. They're about compelling people to answer questions they'd rather avoid. And without that process, the truth stays fractured. After that, everything narrowed. Maxwell was prosecuted, convicted, sentenced. Again, important. But the scope stayed tight, controlled. There was no appetite, or maybe no permission, to widen the frame and pull the entire ecosystem into the light. And that's why this case still haunts people. Not because of conspiracy, not because of secret lists, but because it quietly confirms something a lot of people already fear, that accountability has limits, and those limits tend to appear right where power begins. So when someone asks, what's really in the Epstein files? I don't think the most honest answer is a name or a document or a theory. I think the most honest answer is this. What's in the Epstein files is proof that some stories don't end with resolution. They end with silence. Not because the truth doesn't exist, but because pushing further becomes inconvenient or destabilizing or unacceptable to the system as it is. And maybe that's the hardest part to sit with, that sometimes there isn't a final reveal. Sometimes there's just an uneasy understanding that the system did what it was willing to do, and no more. So maybe the real question was never who was named. Maybe it's who never had to sit in a courtroom, raise their right hand, take a breath, and answer questions when it actually mattered. And maybe that's why this still feels unfinished. And when I say that, I'm not saying it like an accusation. I'm saying it like a question that just never got answered. Because what happens when the center of a case disappears before the case is actually examined? What happens when the one person who could have been forced to talk doesn't? What happens is this strange limbo we're still in now. Because ever since then, everything that's come out has felt like leftovers. Partial disclosures, documents without context, names without testimony, facts without a courtroom to put them under pressure, and people are left to fill in the gaps themselves, which is never a good place to be when the subject is this serious. And I think that's where a lot of the anger comes from, not just curiosity, anger. Because it feels like the rules changed halfway through, like we were told to trust the process, and then the process just stopped responding. Think about it. In most major cases, the public hears evidence after it's tested, after lawyers argue, after witnesses are questioned, after timelines are challenged. Here, we got the opposite. We got raw material, depositions without cross-examination, allegations without resolution, documents without a final verdict. And humans don't do well with unresolved narratives, especially when power is involved. So people pick sides. Some decide the whole thing proves everything is corrupt. Others decide it's all overblown. And both sides talk past each other. Meanwhile, the actual truth, whatever it is in full, just sits there, untouched. And here's something else that doesn't get said enough. This case isn't just about sex crimes. It's about access, about leverage, about proximity, about how certain people can exist in spaces where rules feel optional. It's about how institutions react when accountability threatens their own reputations. Because let's be honest, a full, public, uncomfortable trial wouldn't have just embarrassed individuals. It would have embarrassed systems, universities, foundations, financial institutions, media outlets, political circles, social circles that prefer discretion over daylight. And once you realize that, the silence makes more sense. Not morally, but structurally. That's why every time a new batch of documents gets mentioned, it reignites the same reaction. Not because people expect justice anymore, but because they're still looking for coherence, something that ties it together, something that says, this is how this was allowed to happen, and this is why it won't again. But we never got that conversation. Instead, we got fragments, and fragments are dangerous because they invite speculation where clarity should have lived. And I think deep down, most people understand this. That's why the case still comes up. Not because people are obsessed with Epstein himself, but because he represents a moment where the curtain lifted just enough for people to glimpse something uncomfortable, and then dropped again before anyone could fully see. And once you've seen that, even briefly, you can't unsee it. So no, I don't think the Epstein files are hiding some cinematic twist. I don't think there's a single reveal that would suddenly make everything feel fair. I think what they reveal is something quieter and harder to accept. That sometimes the system doesn't collapse under the weight of the truth. Sometimes it absorbs it. Sometimes it waits it out. Sometimes it outlives the outrage. And that leaves people like us, years later, still talking about it, still circling the same questions, still trying to understand where accountability actually ends. Because if this case teaches anything, it's that justice isn't just about laws. It's about timing. It's about pressure. It's about whether the people involved are too big, too connected, or too insulated to ever be fully examined. And maybe that's why this feels unfinished. Not because we're missing information, but because we're missing a moment where the truth was forced into the open in real time with nowhere to hide. And without that moment, all that's left is this uneasy awareness that some stories don't end with answers. They end with endurance, with people remembering, with people refusing to fully let it go. Because forgetting would be easier. And maybe that's the one thing people still have control over, not letting it fade quietly.